how did this happen where one person could be allegedly involved in the abuse of so many people, including underage women? And how could he not be held to justice? And how do we prevent it from happening again? And that's really at the center of this, despite all this other noise that we have, which is important. We're going to talk about these different angles, but we tend not to talk about the victims in this. And surely, if the Justice Department knows of 1,200 names, there's probably others that we're never going to know about. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Scoop. It is February 2026. I know every time I say, can you believe it? And I guess the question is not, can you believe it? This is just a fact. It is February and it is Groundhog Day. And we got a lot about that in just a moment because, who doesn't love a groundhog? I guess that's maybe a rhetoric question, but you can't help but smile when you see Punxsutawney Phil, although not everyone agrees with that. There's always a little controversy. I'm going to get to that in a moment, including some of our other big stories of the day. We're in the middle of a partial shutdown of the government, some questions about where that heads. We got a few big international stories I'm just going to put on your radar very, very briefly. These are stories I think you should know about what's happening around the world, just in case one of them starts to move to the top of our list as one of our big stories this week. And we got a blockbuster release from the Justice Department on Friday. You know how I feel about Friday releases. We're going to talk about the timing of all of this. 3.5 million pieces of investigatory material related to Jeffrey Epstein. And I'm not going to bury the lead here. I'm not going to bury the lead. Yours truly, Jenna Lee, is found in those files. My name is in those files. And that actually tells us something about this story that I think a lot of folks in the media are missing. And we're not going to do that. So we're going to spend a little bit of time there talking about these files because I know it's a story that many of you care a lot about. Before I get to that, though, can we talk a little bit about whether or not we're going to be in the midst of more winter? This is one of the big stories around the country, is simply just the weather. Let me just show you one of the forecasts from what we're seeing around the country. You have this record chill in a broad swath of the country. And if you're in an area like Tennessee, where some of you are still without power due to the last winter storm, just want to let you know that we haven't forgotten about you. And we know that these conditions are really difficult. It looks like some of this extreme cold is going to be moving its way out rather than staying put. But the weather continues to be a big story around the country. And that's why there is even more attention as to whether or not we would see more or less winter. It all comes down to one groundhog, a tradition that dates back to the 1800s. No one's quite exactly sure how we got here, but we're here. And we're looking at Punxsutawney Phil to tell us what to expect.
It's Punxsutawney Phil!
It is my job this February 2 to look to the skies and report back to you that there is a shadow here on my ground. 6 more weeks of winter abound.
Look at Phil. He looks cozy. Doesn't look bad at all. Very calm. Not everyone believes, though, that Phil's happy with his job, including PETA. PETA does not want to see Phil lifted up in front of a crowd. By the way, because he saw his shadow, the thinking is, the lore is that we'll see 6 more weeks of winter, so another prolonged winter. Just so you know, his track record of accuracy is about 40%. So it's actually, I don't know, probably not that bad compared to other forecasts. We'll see if he's actually correct. PETA, though, has been concerned about this for years and wants us to consider something else when it comes to what we're doing with this said groundhog. And I'm going to read directly from a release from PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. This was released on January 20th, 2026. Tupac, Elvis, and most recently, Suzanne Summers. But could the next big name to be immortalized with a holographic avatar be Punxsutawney Phil? And a letter PETA sent today to the Punxsutawney Groundhog Club president, Tom Dunkel. PETA offers to provide a massive state-of-the-art 3D projection of a groundhog, complete with vocal weather predictions, to light up the stage at Gobbler's Knob each year if Dunkel agrees to finally let Phil and his family retire to a reputable sanctuary. So what you're seeing on your screen, for those of you watching, and for those of you listening on podcasts, I just want you to imagine a massive hologram, maybe in blue, maybe in pink, and just project it on stage that would tell us whether or not we could see more or less winter. This is not the first idea from PETA. They thought of a few different ways that we could maybe announce whether or not we could see spring or winter. A gold medallion was in there. There was a few different ideas, but this year it's a hologram. So my question to you, important, smarter family, is: does a hologram, suffice? Should we move past this practice of holding up a groundhog and having said groundhog predict the weather? I'll leave it to you. The hologram, does it? Are we in an age of AI? We're just going to leave the groundhogs alone and we'll just figure out what to do from there. I don't know, but it's just one idea, and we're here to report the news. We're not here to have you make up your own mind about, we're not going to push anything. We want you to make up your own mind. We're here just to tell you about the conversations that are happening in the world, including a huge hologram of a groundhog that could be our reality someday. You just never know. So that's where we are with that. And apparently we should not put our coats away. I mean, that's the big takeaway from what we heard from the groundhog. Don't put your coat away quite yet. And also, hey, we're thinking about you guys that are dealing with some really tough weather, and we're hoping that moves through and everyone gets their power restored, and we know how serious it can actually be. So sometimes when there's prolonged weather systems, they just don't get the same attention. And that doesn't mean it doesn't have any less of an effect on the communities at hand, whether we're talking about public safety or just business, people getting out and be able to do their jobs and also, participate in the community shop and do such of those things. So I just want to mention that because I definitely do not want to be insensitive. We had a big cold snap here in Texas. As you know, it shuts down everything here because we're not used to ice on the roads. There's no plows. There's no salt. By the way, I fell twice on an ice patch. I thought I was fine. I'd walked around our car a couple times and I was clearing off the ice, and I must have just slipped on something. And the second fall I took, I really had that moment where I thought, oh my gosh, this is how people really get hurt. I'm still black and blue from some of it. It was so silly. So anyways, I just want to put it out there because I don't want to at all kind of shrug off some of that news as well. Let me just take you around a couple big news items that we're seeing here in the United States. We'll go through the week because we are in the midst of a partial government shutdown and there is some uncertainty about the road ahead. So just a few things to have on your radar back here in domestic news. We do have a jobs report coming out Friday. That's what we do expect to be a snapshot of the first month of 2026. We're going to get an idea where the job market starts in January. So we always are watching for that. We have several hearings that we're going to watch on Capitol Hill. One of them has to do with Hezbollah, which is a foreign terrorist group as designated by the U.S. government that's connected to Iran. Just keep that in mind because there could be quite a few questions about Iran and Capitol Hill this week because of some murmurings about a meeting that could be taking place overseas between the United States and Iran. So we're going to pay close attention to that. Not totally domestic news, but want to make sure that we flag this for you. The Olympics opening ceremony is Friday. That's always a nice deep breath in a time that feels particularly partisan and a lot of different opinions out there. We can all unite against everybody else and for Team USA. So we're going to have the opening ceremony on Friday. Also on Sunday, we have the Super Bowl. Not a national holiday, although we will talk about this probably next week. We do get quite a few call outs for work and school the day after the Super Bowl. So words to the wise, that could happen. But also on Sunday, the launch window opens for Artemis. And that is NASA's next big exploration of space. We're sending some astronauts on a trip around the moon. And this is part of our return to the moon that's expected in coming years. So really important mission. And we're not quite sure when it's going to take place. We need that favorable weather. We need that opening of time to do this. And the early reports from this week is that that window could open up on Super Bowl Sunday, which would be very poetic, wouldn't it? We have an American sport that's being played, and we have an American mission going to the moon, not landing on the moon, again, going around it, doing a little reconnaissance, if you will, for the future mission that will land on the moon. So let's talk about the partial government shutdown just briefly here, just give you a quick kind of cliff notes on all of this. So remember, we had the historic government shutdown that happened at the end of last year. What the government is trying to do, what our elected representatives are trying to do, is pass a series of different spending bills that will fund the government. And we had a temporary patch for that. So we got out of that full government shutdown temporarily. And we knew in January, our representatives had to come back and had to negotiate some spending plan. The House did that. The House was able to look at the 12 different spending bills and pass them over to the Senate. And they were sitting in the Senate, and we were up against the deadline because we do know that the end of month is coming, and there could be a funding lapse if those weren't passed. And just that Congress had done their job to at least fund the government again temporarily. It wasn't funding bills that were lasting years and years. It was just getting us a couple more months again, which has been the practice of Congress over the last several years, which is almost a separate conversation. But that's why we keep talking about this all the time, because we don't have these long spending bills. They're just getting us a couple months or even a couple weeks at a time. And so what happened during all of this is the protests in Minneapolis and the shooting that took place a Saturday ago, not last Saturday, but the Saturday before, as you know. And there were plenty of outrage from lawmakers of both parties, quite frankly, about what was happening in Minneapolis and concern about funding going to the Department of Homeland Security, which is the umbrella organization overlooking ICE. Already there was tension over this because of the way that some Democrats perceived the operations taking place in Minneapolis. They did not want to fund ICE. And there seemed to be some sort of agreement where, yes, ICE would get funding, but there would be more funding for body-worn cameras. And that's how there was going to be negotiations. And the Democrats felt that satisfied at least one request. And the Republicans got the funding for the Department of Homeland Security to continue their policy agenda. But that fell apart because of what happened in Minneapolis. And so suddenly you had Democrats saying, we're not going to fund ICE. We're not going to do that. And so negotiations got to a path forward. And essentially what the lawmakers in the Senate said is we're going to fund what we need to fund for the rest of these departments, the rest of these agencies. But for the Department of Homeland Security, we're only giving funding to that agency for 2 weeks. And in that 2 weeks, you guys got to move fast and figure out some parameters around some of these ICE activities that are happening across the country. You know, what that looks like specifically, we don't know. But because the Senate changed something in the spending bill, it has to go back to the House. So the House has to look at that change and approve it. And obviously this happened late in the week, last week. No one's in Washington, D.C. But by the way, there's also bad weather. So you don't have lawmakers returning to D.C. until, Sunday, Monday. And because of the way that things are working out in the House right now, they can't just come in and vote on this change. They have to go through what's called a rules process, which is the procedure that takes place before a vote like this can happen. So the earliest we can see a vote on the Senate's changes to this would be Tuesday. And until that time, those remaining agencies are not funded. And these are big agencies like the Department of Defense, the Department of Transportation. According to the FAA, you're going to have 10,000 air traffic controllers that are going to be furloughed. You can have other people that are working without pay. And the hope is that there's a path forward. There's a vote on Tuesday. The partial shutdown is just a few days, and we're on our way to these departments being funded and debate happening on all sorts of other topics, but not particularly this one. There is that room, though. There's a little asterisk there that we could see that there's not enough support for this bill, that some lawmakers do want to do a little bit more negotiating here. And that could be Republicans and Democrats. Republicans have such a slim majority in the House that they don't have that mass power to just pass through a bill. If they lose one or two votes, it could be the difference of compromise or not within their own party. It's not just about the Democrats. So we'll see what takes place. You have Speaker Johnson, who's relatively confident that this is going to happen. But with Congress, we can have all sorts of things unexpected. So just heads up on that. You might see headlines that we have the partial government shutdown comes to an end, or you could see maybe we're going to delay a vote till Wednesday. Maybe there's other things that are taking place, negotiations that have to happen, and we'll go from there. So I just want to make sure that you guys have a heads up on that. One other thing I want to give you a heads up on is the case out of Minneapolis. As some of you remember, this was a very important case in that it got national attention. There was a little boy who was with his father. The father was being pursued by ICE. And as that father was being pursued by ICE, he was with his 5-year-old son. Some of the headlines read that the 5-year-old was detained by ICE. ICE pushed back on that and said, no, we actually tried to get the 5-year-old to the family. The family did not want to open the door because they were concerned about us. We tried different things. The father asked the 5-year-old to come with him as he was being removed to a facility in Texas. The father's lawyer said He was pursuing an asylum claim. The family had legal permission to be in the country and had not received any removal orders. At the time, I said, we have to remember this is coming from the attorney. The Department of Homeland Security did not comment on his status and oftentimes does not comment on the status of asylum claims. So that wasn't unusual, but we just didn't know what was actually going to happen. So the father and son go to this facility in Texas. And over the weekend, what you should know is that a federal judge ordered them to be removed from that facility. They did have an asylum claim. They did not have removal orders. So, for example, I could be pursuing asylum. I go before a judge. The judge says, I'm sorry, your claim does not meet this narrow definition of asylum. You're going to have to leave. I know you were allowed to stay here, but you're now going to have to leave. I typically have the opportunity to appeal that. And during that appeal, I still have legal permission to be in the country. But there are situations we've seen even over the last several weeks where someone's been ordered to remove twice. Listen, you don't qualify for asylum. I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to stay. And they stay anyways. And if they do that, they are in violation of their permission to be in this country. So we didn't, in this particular case, we didn't really know. Now we have clarity from the federal judge. No, this person is pursuing asylum. They have legal permission to stay, and they haven't been told that they have to leave. They haven't received that order, so they're allowed to stay. So that family is now back in Minneapolis. I just want to make sure that you knew where that story stood, because it was one of those really big stories that came out of the state. Okay, real quick here, I want to take you on a fast trip around the world before we move to the issue of Jeffrey Epstein, another big story. The person that you're seeing on your screen here is an important person to know. Her name is Laura Dogu. She is a two-time U.S. ambassador to Honduras and Nicaragua, and previously served as the foreign policy advisor to the chief of staff of the U.S. Army and at the FBI as a deputy director of the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell. The reason why you should know Laura Dogu, is that she is now our representative on the ground in Venezuela. She is tasked with opening a new diplomatic footprint for the United States. We had shut our embassy down 7 years ago, and she's now on the ground ready to reopen our diplomatic mission. So important update about what's happening in Venezuela. To have an operating embassy in a place where we did not have an operating embassy is a very big deal. We're not quite there yet to say the embassy doors are open, everything's fully functioning, but the fact that she's there and she brings such experience and well respected across the region is really important. She speaks in like a million different languages, by the way, Arabic, clearly Spanish. So very accomplished, has 2 adult sons. So that's something. I have a photo of her arriving in Caracas. So wanted you to be aware of that. Another story I wanted you to be aware of is what's going on in China. And this is a story from the New York Times. We don't know exactly what this headline means. We don't know what the impact of it is, but it's one of those stories to know that it exists. And the headline reads, Xi's military purge may set back his Taiwan ambitions. This whole article is about how China, President Xi in China, has cleared the upper echelon of leadership in his military. And this has raised a lot of questions. I want to read one line to you from this article. Dozens of generals and admirals have been detained or have disappeared over the past 3 years. And there's a question as to why. What's going on with leadership in China? Why is this happening? Why are we seeing this movement of loyalists at one time to President Xi being moved out? And the analysts have a different opinion about what it means. Either that President Xi is consolidating power because he wants to push forward on certain plans to be more aggressive in the region, including being more aggressive perhaps and making a more aggressive move towards Taiwan. There are others suggesting that this turmoil shows a weaker government in China and a weaker Xi. Doesn't mean that he's less dangerous potentially to the world, but that maybe there's a disorganization at those levels and a question about who's the new leadership that's coming in. So just wanted you again to be aware of a headline. I haven't seen that story in many places and wanted to make sure that you saw it as well. And then finally, just a quick note about what's happening in Iran. As you know, we've been covering these protests that have taken place in Iran over the last several weeks, and the news has slowed down regarding that. We had a very, very rough government shutdown of protests in Iran. Pardon the term. I know we were talking about government shutdown here in the United States, but what what the government did is violently put down the protests that were challenging its leadership. And President Trump at the time came out in support of protesters, saying that he would essentially defend them against their government. But that has fizzled out. And the conversation has now returned to what's going on with the nuclear program in Iran. And now there's a question about whether or not a meeting will take place overseas. And there's been different reports about this from a variety of different media sources, the Wall Street Journal, Axios. So there's enough murmurs out there that make me wonder if this is actually going to take place. Right now, we have the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier, along with other battleships, moving to the region. The president actually announced that that was happening last week, and without so many words, threatened that there could be a strike coming if Iran continues to try to develop its nuclear program. Just a reminder, we have 30 to 40,000 American forces in the region. And so this is why when there's any sort of talk about this, we're curious about where this is going next. So the reports are suggesting there could be a meeting that takes place in Turkey between some in Iranian leadership and some in American leadership, specifically Steve Witkoff, who's that special envoy that's been involved in so many different negotiations, whether with Russia or Israel or Hamas, or now when we're talking about Iran. So we want to see if that actually happens. We don't know exactly what the negotiations would be over or how this connects to the protests that have been happening over the last several weeks in Iran. But if we actually saw talks take place, that would be big news, because we don't usually have that between the United States and Iran. Iran, again, is a state-sponsored, State Department designated state sponsor of terrorism. The U.S. says that it is a country that supports terrorist activities around the world, including funding different terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. So we're going to watch that part of the news and see, does the meeting actually happen? Was this just chit-chat? And what to make of some of these reports about what's going on, especially with our military assets moving in that direction. So just a couple news items I wanted to make sure that you knew about. Let me just double check our live chat to see if we have any questions that I'm happy to take as you guys continue to take in the news. Thank you to our Scoop Insiders who are joining us live today. It's always great to see them and have a chit chat before the show, which we did, which is where I shared a little bit about the story we're going to be talking about next, which is this huge release of material related to the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. This has been released by the Department of Justice. It was released on Friday. The timing raises some questions. The content raises some questions. And I've received a lot of questions myself about this story. So we're going to sit here and we're going to talk a little bit about it. I have some sound to share with you. Two things before I get started. One is I like to create a news broadcast that you can listen to with your entire family. Some of what we're going to discuss is dark. This is a dark case. This is a dark story. And so I just, words to the wise, always like to give a heads up before launching into it. And the second thing, and no order of importance, is this, is that although there's a lot to talk about here legally, politically, culturally, we never want to forget who's at the center of the story, which are the victims. The Department of Justice says more than 1,200 people are victims of Jeffrey Epstein. More than 1,200. That's who they know about. And one of the questions that this story is centered around, why it keeps on getting a lot of attention, is several key questions. How did this happen where one person could be allegedly involved in the abuse of so many people, including underage women? And how could he not be held to justice? How did this happen? And how do we prevent it from happening again? And that's really at the center of this, despite all this other noise that we have, which is important. We're going to talk about these different angles, but we tend not to talk about the victims in this. And surely, if the Justice Department knows of 1,200 names, there's probably others that we're never going to know about. And I don't want to forget them in this. So just as we're setting the stage here, I want you to listen to the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche. This is him speaking about the release of these documents. By the way, it's not just documents. It's videos, it's photos, it's all this material related to the Justice Department investigation into Jeffrey Epstein, that after Jeffrey Epstein's death that happened in 2019, and there was no one else to pursue the case for, except for his associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, there's been all sorts of questions about why that's the case. And so with those questions of why is that the case, that there's only 2 people that could be charged related to these allegations, like what are we not seeing here? This is where Congress, bipartisan effort of Congress, put together a bill that was passed through both houses and signed by the president, the Jeffrey Epstein Transparency Act, that forced the Justice Department's hands to turn over documents. They have some documents or material that they can hold back as part of the investigation if there's active investigations related to it ongoing. So we don't have everything. But I want you to hear how Todd Blanche describes what happened on Friday.
Small number of documents, as I said on Friday, that we're waiting for a judge to say we're allowed to release because of a protective order. But this review is over. I mean, we reviewed over 6 million pieces of paper, thousands of videos, tens of thousands of images, and which is what the statute required us to do. You know, it's interesting. Leadership on the Hill, Congressman Massey, Senator Schumer, are quick to complain. There is no way they have spent any time looking at the materials we produce, because I know the materials we produce. We produced them on Friday. By Saturday, they're already complaining about what we did. And by the way, apparently Massey and others wrote a letter to come and review unredacted materials. I didn't get that letter yet. They leaked it to the press before they actually sent it to me. But yeah, that's absolutely, totally fine. We have nothing to hide. We have nothing to hide. We never did. And our doors are open if they want to come and review any of the materials that we produced.
By the way, Thomas Massey, a Republican congressman, responded on social media with a timestamp of when they sent the email on Friday evening over to Todd Blanche requesting this. I mean, there's just a lot of back and forth here. But what was important about what the Deputy Attorney General said here is a few things. He said, this review is over. This review is over. So what he's saying is that the Justice Department was required by Congress to review this material and release it to the public in a very unprecedented move. We rarely, if ever, get a look at material related to investigation. We just don't, because either we're going to see that in court, or it's an active investigation that's ongoing, that the material is part of other things, or we just don't see it. I mean, there's, like we've talked about in the past, any one of us could be under investigation and never know it. Could happen. We would have no idea, because it's not something that law enforcement has to share with us if they're looking into someone potentially committing a crime. Those roads may not lead anywhere. And so there's nothing at the end of the road. So we wouldn't know that. So this is very rare that we get this behind the scenes into what the Justice Department actually saw. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I want you to hear from Ro Khanna. Ro Khanna was a partner with Thomas Massey. Thomas Massey's a Republican, Ro Khanna is a Democrat. They are the ones that partnered together in the House of Representatives to put together a way to force a vote on this bill in the House. Why did they have to do that? Because Speaker Johnson didn't want to have a vote on this. The president, the Justice Department said, we had reviewed, as promised, as part of our campaign promise to America, we have reviewed these documents. We've reviewed this material. There's no client list we're going to release, and there's no additional charges. Case closed. And the public did not like that, including supporters of President Trump. And there was pressure on Republicans to do more. And so we had this partnership between a Democrat and a Republican in the House to put together a way to force a vote that would sidestep essentially the Speaker of the House, who's a Republican, a supporter of President Trump. So I want you to hear what Ro Khanna, we cut together a little bit of what he had to say in an interview this weekend. I want you to hear his pushback on Deputy Attorney General Blanche.
At best, half the documents, but even those shock the conscience of this country. The survivors' lawyers that I've talked to have said that the survivors are still upset. They're upset that many of their names accidentally came out without redactions, and they want to make sure the rest of the files come out. There are rich and powerful people who may not have committed a crime, but who are emailing Jeffrey Epstein well after he's a pedophile, talking about going to his island, talking about wanting to participate in wild parties. And the American people are asking, how are rich and powerful people living in this country? What moral code are they living by? Some of those revelations are deeply disturbing. They did do a release that was significant. I mean, this is the most documents that we have seen released so far in history, but it is not good enough. And so Thomas Massey and I have requested a meeting with the Deputy Attorney General. He said he's open to meeting with members of Congress. He said he's open to explaining why the redactions were done. So I hope that we will have a meeting. If we don't get the remaining files, if we do not get the remaining 302 forms, the remaining prosecution memo from 2019, and if the survivors are not happy, then Thomas Massey and I are prepared to move on impeachment or contempt.
Okay, so according to Rokana, this isn't over. So Todd Blanche, the Justice Department saying, listen, this review is over. And the elected representatives are saying, not so fast. We have some other questions about this as well, and we want to take a look at some of this material. A couple of things that he said there that I just want to pull out for you. One, he talked about those that made questionable judgments associated with Jeffrey Epstein that are exposed in these files. And questionable judgment is in the eye of the beholder. We're going to revisit that in a second. He also talked about the victims and those that are part of the investigation that maybe want more or also are concerned about their information also being shared. So we're going to get to that in a moment, because there were all sorts of questions about what sort of precedent this sets. If you have Congress pass a bill requiring the Justice Department to expose their investigation because of a lack of trust in the federal government, that's one thing. But if it sets a precedent where other investigations are having to reveal material, what does that do to the nature of investigations that have to take place behind closed doors in order to make sure that justice is done? So it can cut both ways. Before we get into that, though, I just want to do a quick review, because I do think this is important. Why are we even talking about Jeffrey Epstein now? How did this even continue to come up? I always think this review is important. So if we go back to 2007, 2008, Jeffrey Epstein, who is a power player, is a power broker, works in finance, sort of like as he's a shadowy figure. No one knows exactly what he does. Helps rich people. It's but he's everywhere. He's with everyone, with all these different powerful people, all political parties, a lot of rich people doing all sorts of things, very, social. He's that sort of figure. Well, he has a plea deal that happens in the state of Florida. Just to be clear about this, he faced both state and federal charges in Florida, both state and federal charges. But there was a plea deal against these charges, and the charges were related to prostitution and the procurement of prostitution with a minor. The important things about these charges is that it's really individual, meaning it was about his actions. Those were the allegations were around his actions and the federal and state charges, but the plea deal pushed away the federal charges, and the state charges are what he pled guilty to. And he served time. I'm going to put those in quotations because it's questionable how he served. He was able to be in and out of a facility for most of the day. He didn't, he had very loose requirements to fulfill his obligations to the punishment related to this plea deal. But this happens in 2008. And I want you to think back onto this time. For those of us who were a part of the news environment at this time, I was covering national news at the Fox Business Network. And there was a huge financial crisis. So the focus of the news was on the financial crisis and what was happening with the economy. And I got to tell you, I don't remember covering this story related to a top person in finance in the state of Florida. And this was a different social media environment too. X, Twitter was still sort of just coming out. It was just starting to really harness the power of social media at the time. Not that all news is not local, it's that right now, if there's a story that like this that happens in Florida, it's all over social media. There's a way to come across it, as you guys know, on your own feeds. You can get a local news story that then becomes national news. And in our look at the coverage here, there was coverage of this happening in the state of Florida. The question is how broad of coverage did that reach? And over the years, there have been reports of different journalists that have looked into Jeffrey Epstein and looked into his activities and raised questions, but none of their stories rose to the level of what happened in 2018. So in 2018, the Miami Herald does a report on Jeffrey Epstein. They started to look into, in part, the labor secretary of the first Trump administration is the man that was responsible for this plea deal. He was the attorney general of Florida at the time. And so the federal charges could have happened if he pushed forward. So there was a look into all of this related to a new administration, but the Jeffrey Epstein becomes the focus of this investigative report of the Miami Herald. That happens in late 2018. And by 2019, we see new federal charges against Jeffrey Epstein. We see national news about it. He's held in custody and he faces very big charges. These are not charges just about him as an individual. Yes, they're about him as an individual, but they're related to crimes that are not just about something that he individually committed. It's about sex trafficking. These charges are very, very serious, where he could face decades, if not an entire lifetime in prison. So there was a reference to those charges at a federal level that other people could be involved. That's where this question comes from. Where are the other people involved? So if you're accusing someone of sex trafficking, then aren't there other people that are involved in those sex trafficking? That's how people are moved across state lines and are used in this way, in this criminal activity. It's not one to one person. Is it one to others? Who are these other people? See, these are why these questions come up, and this is why this gets a little lost in the reporting. And I want you to know that it's not just that people are, curious about conspiracies, and I hate that word conspiracy because people have questions. The nature of these charges begs people to ask, are there others involved because of the serious nature? And as you know, according to the government, Jeffrey Epstein commits suicide in prison. He doesn't face any charges. His associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, is charged. She's convicted and she is serving time, but nobody else has been charged. And that's why there's been questions about this. So I want you to understand how this moves. If I look at some of the documents, and listen, there are 3.5 million pieces of investigatory material. I just am barely skimming the surface. I'm very curious about how news traveled related to Jeffrey Epstein. I didn't know him, and I didn't have any interaction with him. I never had to think about booking him as a guest and wondering, do we mention his criminal activity in the past? Like, how many people knew that, how well known that was, that he not only was convicted, pled guilty to these crimes in Florida, he was also a registered sex offender after that. And by the way, even those were state charges that he pled guilty to, this plea deal. If you're registered as a sex offender, that crosses state lines. You're required to do different things in different states. So I'm not suggesting that people didn't know something was up, but I also think understanding the different media environment is important to also answering that question. Why wasn't this a bigger story? Okay, so that happened in 2008. What happens about 2012? What about 2015, 2016? Why was there a sudden flurry of activity? And it was due to the Miami Herald report in 2018, and that led to those federal charges in New York. So the one thing that the Deputy Attorney General said in his press conference on Friday, and yes, it was interesting that they chose Friday to release this. They said this is the time. They had reviewed all the documents. They had done their very best. And that these were the documents and the material that they were going to push out. You always watch news on a Friday because it tends to be a time when strategically people put news out there to try to get less attention. Because let's face it, a lot of us on a Friday don't want to dig into a brand new story. We're not going to look into something new, just even as consumers of news, let alone journalists. People want to get on with their weekend. You put the news out on Friday. By Saturday, Sunday, it's chewed over a little bit. Monday, you're off to a different news cycle. So there's a strategy to that that's very well known across politicians and corporations and everything else. You want to leak something that's happening, do it on a Friday evening. Very few people are going to pay attention. Sometimes in this sort of world with social media, it doesn't really work the same way, but it was a Friday release. And because of the criticism that the Trump administration was fielding that week on all sorts of different issues, it's fair to ask, was this also an effort by the Justice Department that was under fire about how they were enforcing the law in places like Minneapolis? And what did that look like? And what were investigations to change its topic to another big news story? And it worked, by the way, because it is a big news story and we need to pay attention to it. So the timing of it was interesting. Todd Blanchard said this, again, the Deputy Attorney General, he did make reference that the Attorney General in New York that was overseeing this case, the federal charges in New York against Jeffrey Epstein, he couldn't speak for him and other sort of investigations that could be taking place in parallel to this. And he didn't really answer a question as to whether or not other charges could be coming. But he did have this exchange with the journalist that I think hits on a question that many of you have. And so because of this exchange, I wanted to grab it for you.
This is the end of the Epstein, of your review of the Epstein files. So just to clarify, is the public going to learn the identities of the men who abused the girls with the information that you're releasing? And if not, why not? And then I have a quick follow-up.
I mean, you just baked in an assumption into your question that I have never said and I don't know to be true. Is the public going to learn about men that abuse these girls? Like, what does that mean? I mean, I don't understand what that means.
Well, I mean, they're the men who abused the young women through Epstein's.
Look, we said in July, and it remains as true today as it was in July. If we had information, we meaning the Department of Justice, about men who abused women, we would prosecute them, right? We talked about the work that we're doing. That's why I said that. I said this earlier. There's this built-in assumption that somehow there's this hidden tranche of information of men that we know about we're covering up or that we're choosing not to prosecute. That is not the case. I don't know whether there are men out there that abuse these women. If we learn about information and evidence that allows us to prosecute them, you better believe we will. But I don't think that the public or you all are going to uncover men within the Epstein files that abuse women, unfortunately.
But that is what's happening now, is people have seen different names that are listed in the files. Those that are associated with Jeffrey Epstein are being incriminated or thought to be part of his alleged crimes. And while we understand that there's a preponderance of evidence against Jeffrey Epstein, he did not face his day in court. So we still say allegations, although we can all agree the evidence is extreme with the number of people that have come forward to say that they were abused by this man. So we can recognize both of those things. But those that did not want to see this investigation material released had some concerns. They were concerned about victims. They were concerned about the identity of victims and re-traumatizing them, exposing them to the press, and having anyone in the public have access to their claims that they thought were private and told to an investigator. And the other concern was that there would be those that are listed in the Jeffrey Epstein files that really had nothing to do with him, or had something to do with him but had nothing to do with his crimes. And that leads to what Ro Khanna said, which is a question about judgment and moral compass, but not necessarily a question about criminal activity. And that's tough because those that are named in the files are instantly associated with a person that many believe is absolutely responsible for abusing innocent people. So we have both of those things happening right now, by the way. You have lawyers from the victims that are now approaching the Justice Department and saying all of this material has to be taken down, because there are moments in these millions and millions of pages where a victim's name is blocked, but then other pages that name is not blocked. And was it just a mistake? There was just too many documents. How did someone not just do a word search for that victim? There's even some personal information that's been provided. So now we have a situation for those that were advocating for the release of these files are now saying, wait a minute, we're not sure they should stay released because of concerns specifically for the victims. The question of what's happening in the court of public opinion about those that are exchanging emails or communications with Jeffrey Epstein, the nature of those relationships, that's actually playing out in exactly that, the court of public opinion, but not a court of law. And what the deputy attorney general here is saying, if we had charges of criminal activity, if we had criminal activity that we knew about, those charges would be levied, but they haven't been. So does that mean that people that are listed in these files are exonerated from any wrongdoing, or at least any criminal wrongdoing? How are we to read that? And again, it goes back to the charges. If the charges are sex trafficking because of a description of a network of dark, sadistic activity, does that network only involve two people? And is the public supposed to believe that? That question has never really been answered, other than, according to the Justice Department, there's been no other charges that we need to file. And that's raised the question. That has raised the question in the public. And that question continues to today. So let me show you how I was listed in the Epstein files. And I think that shows us something. I'm going to walk you through this. Let me see if I can pull it up so I can show you how you can do it, because you can do this too. And it's important to know when something's available to you, because I'm going to walk you through how it's done. So this is the press release from Friday. And I'll explain why I searched my name in a second. There was a reason for that. This is one of the press releases. Let me go back to another one. Okay. I'm all over the Justice Department these days, and unfortunately all the pages look the same. So let me make sure I'm showing you the right one. All right. So this is the press release from Friday. Department of Justice publishes 3.5 million responsive pages in compliance with the Epstein Files Transparency Act. You go through. All right. To access the full letter to the Justice Department sent to Congress, you click here. To access all files produced, you clicked here. All right, great. Am I 18 years of age or older? I know it's questionable, but yes, I am. All right, I'm verified. I don't know what that means. The Justice Department is tracking me now. That's what I think these mean. Okay, so you see court records, disclosures, Freedom of Information Act. These are the different disclosures that have taken place. Let's go ahead and put in my name, Jenna Lee. Search. All right. Here's all the different documents that show my name. There are several, 11. There's 10 on one page. I'm just going to click one of them. And what you see here is a PDF of an email exchange. And if you go down to, let's say, page 3, 4, 5. Oh, see Jeffrey Epstein here. Looks like he would, well, Jeff Epstein, I don't know if this is the same one. Could be a common name. I'm going to show you where I am. See if I can highlight for you. Okay, so here I am on page 6. Okay, the reason why I'm showing you this is because it actually tells us something about these documents and the names that could be present in these documents, including my own. So how am I even involved in these files? This was an email exchange of someone, I don't know, had sent to Jeffrey Epstein back in, let's see if we can look at the date, in 2012. And so this is someone that forwarded an email. She was invited to an event. She forwards the email to another person, to Jeffrey Epstein, and with a question, is this worthwhile? So this is an event. She's saying, should I attend this event? And Jeffrey Epstein replies, Sundance is nice, go. Like, that's all. It's a very innocuous exchange. So what is this event? This event was something I was invited to when I was a news anchor on Fox News. I was invited by a colleague of mine who was a columnist for a major newspaper. There was a big conference that was being put together with people from different industry and different voices represented. And it was going to be a 2-day conference that was going to, let me see if I can actually read it to you, a 2-day bipartisan retreat discussing how to change the world. No speeches, just many moderated breakout discussions of 16 and 15 people on various topics. We had designed the agenda around your ideas and needs. What's interesting about this is I actually remember getting this invite and being like, wow, it sounds like a really great event. I think I was invited twice actually to it. And in both circumstances, I wasn't able to go. At that time, it was very difficult to take time off. And this idea of taking time off for a conference, especially I think one was actually abroad. This one happened to be stateside. I just didn't know how I was going to do it. And one particular time I was pregnant. So that also was like, you know what, a conference discussing world events sounds awesome. I have some other priorities, but it's a really interesting list of people that were invited, that were from all sorts of different industries and all sorts of different names here that you may actually recognize. If you go through, I can even link to this PDF so you can see it in our show notes, just so you can see an example of what this looks like and what's actually redacted. So am I mentioned in relation to Jeffrey Epstein at all, or related to any sort of crimes? Of course not. I'm on some invite list of an event that I don't even know if I accepted the invite to, and it was a promotional material for the event. I didn't even attend the event. But if you saw that email, you might think that I attended the event, that I was an insider with these other different people from different industries. And the reality is that it was a very kind of random mention. So the event, again, was not sent to Jeffrey Epstein directly. It was sent to a few people and then emailed to Jeffrey Epstein for his opinion on it. I never committed to participate in the event. It was kind of a minor thing. But forever, if someone ever wanted to say your name is in the Jeffrey Epstein files, my name is definitely listed in the files. I just happen to be in this email. And so why did I want to share this with you? I think it does show us something. And I'm not pulling away what some are taking away from this release. I mean, there's so many different documents and information. If someone wants to go through these for months and months, I think we could hear about it for a long time. It's just a lot of material and it's very dense. So in the 11 times that I mentioned, it's all part of the same email, and it's like a different part of the email exchange and thread. So there's 11 different mentions of my name, but not related to 11 unique pieces of content. It's all the same email. And so in many cases, what you're seeing is email exchanges that are 1 or 2 words, setting up of appointments and exchange of different things. That same very basic email asking about a meeting time maybe appears, 5 or 6 or 10 or 12 times. So it's not 3.5 million pieces of material that are unique. And that's really critical, because the appearance, like, oh my God, this is so many different pieces of evidence that we get to see. It's not exactly like that. Take my own case as an example. It's 11 different mentions with the same material. It's not actually new. It just adds more to the clutter of trying to push through this. So I thought that was interesting. I think it brings up the question of whether or not, and it's an age-old question, quantity equals quality. And the release that Congress was searching for, the question here is, does it get us closer to the truth? is this more information actually getting us closer to the truth, or is it distracting us from something else? Is the quality so poor with this information that there's going to be a lot of people caught up in this dragnet? A lot of people with associations or email exchanges with Jeffrey Epstein that may or may not be incriminating or questionable. And those storylines are going to play out. The question is, was what I start with, which is the victims. Are we closer to getting justice for them or truth on this topic based on this huge release of information that in many cases is repetitive and not clear about what exactly it means? So again, a headline could read Jenna Lee and Jeffrey Epstein files, but that headline would be meaningless. It'd be misleading, and the information would be innocuous, right? It doesn't really apply to anything. So just think that's important to keep in mind. I expect a lot more information to come from these documents. A lot more people, their names are going to come forward. And there is the court of law and the court of public opinion, and those oftentimes are different. But we want to be clear about what's happening in either place. What the Justice Department is saying is that no other charges are coming right now. Doesn't mean forever, but at least right now. The court of public opinion is faster than that, though. So some of both the benefit, what those were arguing for, release of more light, more transparency, that has come. We have more documents. The question is, what do those documents actually mean to getting closer to the truth? So I want you to see that it's easy to access that information. If you want to go in and look around and poke around and put in some names that you can see a lot of detail. But it's not what it looks like in Law and Order episode. There's a lot of repetition. It's a lot to work through. So again, I expect a lot over the next several weeks and months, quite frankly, to continue to come from this, and really a question of the effect of it. So why did I search for my name? Was I just why would you do that? What would that be? I have to tell you, when I started to see the news coming out of what the conversations were regarding Jeffrey Epstein and who he talked to, I knew a few things. One is I worked in media from 2007 to 2017, and traditional media, in major broadcasts, national news anchor. I hosted my own show for 7 years. I left in 2017 for many reasons, including the fact that I believe in nonpartisan news, and I believe that's what you should have. And I believe there's a market for it, and there's a whole backstory to that. But there was additional reasons, and part of it was seeing the power structure. Those in media and those in wealth and finance and the power brokers that are making the calls and making things happen is a very tight group of individuals. And I knew that because I worked for Fox News and because I worked with quite a few high-profile people, that the chances that I could be mentioned in these emails or these documents was not zero. I've also seen the way that there have been those that have talked about women that are on television in ways that are very inappropriate in email and text message and all sorts of things. So again, I knew that the chance of being named was not zero, and my curiosity led me to that. So that's why I did it. And I was actually, again, I didn't think the chance was zero, but I didn't actually think I would see my name. And I feel like it was a great example, though, to share with you of the risk benefit of this, and something to think a little bit deeper about. Not only how does the release of this information, investigation or files relate to this case, but also in general, could we see this in other high profile cases? But what I land at still is a question about the truth. And there's a feeling in the public, there's a feeling in the press, there's a feeling from many of you that we just don't have the answer here. There's something else going on. And what I've learned is that those gut checks, however you want to describe them, are there for a reason, and they can't easily be dismissed, and they can't easily be satisfied. So where this story goes from here is unclear. Is this the last major release we ever see from the Justice Department related to Jeffrey Epstein? Do the sleuths that exist in the public, those of you on YouTube and those of you that are detectives and retired and looking through documents, find something that federal investigators missed that leads to a break in this, that takes us in a different path? Those possibilities are on the table right now. We have a huge mass of information and a question about how to contextually place it in a way that could be very helpful to the public. And as a journalist, that's always what I want to do, is to be helpful to you and make sure you're informed about any of these big stories. So just wanted to share that with you. If you have any questions about it, I'm happy to share any more information with you. Jim's asking, so just like you plugged in your name in the search bar, anyone's name could be correct. Yeah, Jim, you could go in and you could plug in your name and see if there's another, Jim Murray that was mentioned in the email. Do you want to do it right now? No, give me a name. I'll search it for you guys right now. And we could just take a look at it and see what's there. Let's see if this is, Leanne says, so no victim has provided any names of those that abuse them. Has Todd spoken to the victim? So this is an interesting question, because there have been many allegations waged on rich and powerful men participating in criminal activity. But for whatever reason, the Justice Department has said that they have not been able to prosecute those cases. And that's where it stands right now. It's not that the allegations don't exist, that they weren't able to pursue those cases for whatever reason. So let's see what another question is. So the mainstream media can say someone was in the files, but it could just be the context like you are and insinuate something worse. Exactly. So that is the downside. There could be email exchanges. I saw one last night. It was so random. Like I was just poking through as, random files just to see what I could see. And one of them was that Jeffrey Epstein had sent someone, I don't know the person, a question about, could you meet with this person? And they were like, sure. And you wonder, is that person now incriminated for just even responding to Jeffrey Epstein because Jeffrey Epstein was a known sex offender? Did that person know that Jeffrey Epstein had that past? Did they meet at a party? I'll give you this example. My husband and I were with our kids this weekend, and we struck up a conversation with a guy who works in finance, and my husband and him, they're talking and they exchange information. And we talked about that related to this case to say, what if someday we find out that stranger that we just had a conversation with while our kids are playing turns out to be like a bad dude and your name is in his phone, and now it looks like maybe you knew him or that you had some sort of communication with him, and you never know that. So there are situations here where that's happening. And that's up to you to decide, like, should that person who exchanged an email with him know about his past and knew about it enough to distance themselves? What happens if they responded to him to not meet with him and meet with that person? It's hard to read into some of these exchanges. We know what we know now because of the Miami Herald doing the work in 2018. We would not be talking about this. There was no one out there that had a microphone loud enough to get this story seen. And it was the timing in 2018. And clearly there was not good blood between President Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. One-time friends, then turned enemies, and a Justice Department that said, guess what? You had a plea deal that you did in 2008. We don't care. We're going to pursue federal charges against you in New York, buddy. And that's exactly what they did. I don't know if it would happen the same way under a different president. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. And so while there's a lot of strong emotion now about this, that's why I keep going back to the victims, because as I have seen in media and different, scandals that I had a front row seat to, there are those that use the scandal for their own gain. And that's also very dark. So we don't want to partake in that. So yes, there are people's names that are in these files that could mean nothing. I was curious about the assistants to Jeffrey Epstein. Did they know things that were happening? You would think that they had all been questioned. There's a lot of people involved here, a lot of information. So just want you to know the breadth of it, the depth of it. And, from here, we'll continue to see what happens next, who will take the lead. And maybe it's that these questions continue from our elected representatives and we get more information, and maybe the story doesn't go far from here. I mean, that's the story. We have not seen new charges after Ghislaine Maxwell, period. What would that news charge be? Who would be that person? Who would be the person that could charge them, that could bring charges? What would that look like? I'm sure there's a lot of busy lawyers out there. So not to say that we wouldn't see it, but I just want you to understand what we got on Friday. So we'll see where it goes from here, just like any story. Again, kind of an unexpected Jenna Lee reference in the Epstein files, but it allowed us to talk a little bit more in depth about what's going on here. So I welcome your questions on that. I'm going to leave you now. I know we spend a lot of time on that story, but I just wanted to make sure it's just a point of such curiosity. I know so many of you are very concerned about it. I understand your concern. And anytime that we can go back to the timeline of the story, understand the different twists and turns of it. This is why I bring up the past, because I want us to understand like what was everyone parachuted into this story really in 2019. There's a lot of background there and a lot of questions still that got us to that point. And kudos to the Miami Herald, because without their work, we wouldn't be here. We just won. And an example during a time when I know it's really easy to be down on the press, like this is an example of investigatory work that led to charges and led to a spotlight on victims. And again, a question about what does justice look like from here? So I'll leave you with that. And a few more weeks of winter as everything comes full circle. Thank you for your support of quick, concise, nonpartisan, smarter news, where we believe that quality comes from being concise, being nonpartisan, and prioritizing you. And we'll continue to do so. Thank you for your permission to serve you during these historic times. And we'll be back with more related to all the big stories of the week on this channel and others on smarternews.com. Have a great day, guys. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.